Finally, can we answer this question? Which makes better espresso? Flats or conicals? Until now, we haven't had a fair test. Every grinder is different sized burrs, different chamber architecture, different declumpers and grind retention. But on my bench, I have the Varia VS6, exactly the same grinder with conicals and flats. But I'm gonna go 2 steps further in this video because even espresso nuts don't know how deep this rabbit hole goes. Disclosures time, Varia was gracious enough to send me the VS6 along with 4 different burr options so I could test the different burr types while reducing outside variables to basically 0 because it's literally the same grinder. They aren't paying me and have agreed to have no say over the content. So the traditional explanations of the differences between grinders firstly talk about grind size. And obviously, if a grinder can't grind fine enough or have accurate enough adjustments at the lower end for espresso, then it's obviously not going to produce a great shot. This is true of most electric grinders that cost less than about £100, and even some grinders included in those all-in-one espresso machines. So this is a given that we need to grind fine enough for espresso, and then the conversation turns to variance. If the variation in grind sizes is very large, then this will also produce a crappy shot. For an extreme example, look at what a blade grinder does to coffee. So you get some massive chunks like this one that just bounced around inside without actually hitting the blades. And then you get these finer particles that got stuck below the blades and then chopped 100 times more than these bits. This is why we don't use blade grinders for coffee. This massive variation means that when you're brewing, the finest grinds get fully extracted of all their tasty coffee solubles really fast, and you barely extract any from those massive chunks, so the coffee is gonna taste god-awful. The most commonly talked about difference between flats and conicals is that the variance is different, with flats widely recognized as having more uniform grind size, although this does depend a lot on which burrs we're talking about, and I'll get onto that later. You see, when you look at either flats or conicals, the first thing you see is the size, which is going to have a big effect both on the grinding speed and the potential of the grinder. I'm not 100% confident on this, but from my current understanding, the bigger the burrs are, the more potential the coffee grinder has to produce excellent coffee grounds. Depending on the grinder housing and design of things like the grinder chamber or chute, as well as the blade's material and shape, you can get closer to the full potential of the burr. The most common sizes of flat burrs I've tested have been 54, 64, 78, and 83 millimeters, and the ones in the VS6 are 58 millimeters, with the conicals being 63 millimeters. The biggest grinder burrs I've heard about are inexpensive grinders like the Option O Lagon P100 that have gigantic 98mm flat burrs. I wish I had one to show you the actual burrs themselves, but I don't. Hopefully I'll get one some way, but I did see them using this grinder in Glitch Coffee in Tokyo. It is a serious piece of kit. But even looking at the difference between 58mm burrs and 83mm burrs that I do have should show you that this is not a small difference, and the surface area that can be used for grinding goes up massively between these two sizes. The most obvious difference this makes is that bigger burrs can grind through coffee faster. Here's a side-by-side of the VS6 versus the DF83V, both running on 1600 RPM. Even with a very expensive grinder with big burrs on the ultra-fine scale, there's still a lot of variance. Check out the distribution measured with the D-fluid on the particle analyzer on the espresso grind from a VS6 using the stock flat 58mm burrs. On the left we have the smallest grinds, and on the right we have the biggest, and from this you can see that some of the coarsest grinds are literally multiples of the size of the smaller ones, and this is with a relatively expensive grinder that is focused on uniformity. So all of these comparisons of grind sizes are going to be more about the contrast to each other rather than some objective measure of uniform versus not uniform. It's basically impossible with current technology to just have an exact grind range coming straight out of the grinder. We can use something like this, a Cruve sifter, to further sift down to specific grind sizes. It's time consuming, but it will get you there. But then what you'll probably find for espresso is that even after dialing in for a specific grind size like this, you might not find that the coffee tastes all that good. Meh. That's because a little variation adds texture, which is probably the thing that enthusiasts talk about the most when it comes to coffee grinder burr types. This is the idea that because of the shape, size, and angles of the grinder burrs, Conicals tend to produce a little more variance in grind size than flats, which means it's likely to prioritize texture, body, and richness, and flat burrs, being more uniform, will have more clarity of flavor. The typical examples will show a unimodal distribution for flat burrs, that is, a single spike of grinds that are the most common, and then a bimodal distribution for conical burrs, so it would look more like 2 spikes either side of a median. While this is generally true, there are big differences in geometry between different burrs, as you can see here on the distribution graphs for the multi-purpose flats and the hypernova flats for the VS6. Both are flat burrs, but they have very different variances in grind size due to the geometries of the cutting fins. I've had flat burrs that have a profile that tastes a lot more like a conical. For example, the Time War Sculptor 078S original flat burrs weren't really to my liking because I felt like they got the worst of both worlds, with muddy flavor, i.e. low clarity for a flat burr, and not all that much texture like a conical burr. And what I found in testing lots of grinders on this channel is that grinders and burrs that have higher amounts of fines are more likely to produce a bad tasting espresso. This is because over-extraction of fines will make the coffee much more bitter, which is a far more unpleasant taste to most people than an under-extracted coffee that will taste more sour. So it makes sense that higher variance isn't the only important thing, but where that variance is, on the fine end or on the coarse end. And it's definitely not better to try and have even variance, which would look like a flat line on a distribution graph with lots of fines and lots of coarses, as you generally end up with a very muddy, boring, and flat tasting coffee. Then we get into grinding speed, which adds a little more complexity to the variance. I don't know enough about this yet to really make strong conclusions about all the things that variable speed could be doing to coffee grounds. Hopefully this year I'll be able to talk with some experts to understand this better and share it with you, but the most obvious difference is that slower grind speeds tend to produce more consistency in the grind size, which then leads to more clarity. So now, with more availability of different burr options and the spread of variable grind speed to affordable grinders, is becoming a lot more complex than just grind size distribution. The different architectures or geometries, and by that I mean the angles, directions, and depths of the grinding blades and fins, are not getting enough attention on two major fronts. Before I get into the weeds on something I don't think coffee people talk about enough, I want to point out how much easier it's been to notice and improve my coffee tasting palette by keeping proper detailed notes. I made this book, the Brew Ledger, to help you keep track of your settings so you can dial in different coffees quickly, even if you have multiple different coffees you're trying at a time. But it's also helped me to recognize big differences between different grinder and burr types as I've been testing them for videos on this channel. Nobody is sponsoring this video, so if you want me to be able to keep this channel going and teaching about espresso, coffee technology, doing reviews and latte art, the best way to do that is to buy this book. Not only does this help me to continue the channel, but you also get a really great espresso journal that has tons of glowing reviews. I'll leave a link in the description. So there are two things that affect grinders more than people know, and they're becoming clearer in conversations I've had with some of my friends, most notably Amira and Nadia from Our Coffee Shelter, and Aaron, who just started Coffee Gear Lab on Instagram. The first is that I think shape plays a much bigger role than most people realize, or that anyone really talks about in the mainstream coffee conversations on YouTube or Instagram. Just think about it for a second. If you have a round, bowl-shaped coffee ground, this is going to extract coffee very differently from a flat, plain-like coffee ground. I'm going to call these coffee grind types rounds and planes just to make it clear. Now, just reasoning from first principles, it makes sense that the planes extract fully very quickly because they have a much bigger surface area in direct contact with water when compared to rounds. So then we have to figure out what kinds of shapes different grinder burr geometries cut, trim, shave, or crush coffee grounds into. To talk about this without looking at it using a high-powered microscope would be difficult to draw accurate conclusions from, but what I would guess is that multi-purpose burrs would shave off edges in rotations, leading to rounder shapes, and the deeper differentiation in espresso burrs, like the hypernovas, would make more edges and planes, meaning faster extraction. Because Conicals crush beans between the fins, I expect there would be more irregular shapes, reducing surface area, which would make sense as the flavor isn't as intense, so it's likely the grinds have less surface area to extract from. Once I get an opportunity to look at this through a high-powered microscope, I will definitely share those results with you. If someone bought an expensive grinder or some nice new SSP burrs and say they aren't making good coffee, or they get a lot of channeling or something like that, people will usually tell them to make sure that the burr is aligned. But alignment is so much more than that, and even imperceptible differences can make a massive difference without most people really being able to check. With these 58mm burrs in the VS6, it's incredibly easy to get alignment because of the inverted design of the burr carrier. Varia made this so that instead of attaching the burr to the housing like you do with many other coffee grinders, the burrs simply align with each other inside a fixed housing, meaning that you can swap burrs in and out in minutes with no need to worry about alignment. For me, this is a godsend because one of my least favorite jobs is aligning grinder burrs, and it also means that this variable is largely handled by the engineering of the machine. For other grinders, you have to take it apart and put it back together multiple times, doing your marker test to see where the misalignment is, and then making shims out of aluminium to angle it back and forth, and it's just generally not fun. The bigger your burrs are, the harder this is to get right, and this is when the real problem comes in, when you get up to that commercial scale grinders like the previously mentioned Option O, or something like those Malkonig big boy grinders. Getting the burrs to align well enough is actually insanely hard and requires specialized tools. Even a few micrometers or even nanometers. Is it nanometers next or picometers? I don't know. But a very, very small difference in alignment on one side or the other when you have 98mm burrs is going to wreck every coffee that comes out of it. The difference is insane. If you're interested, there's a grinder manufacturer called Ozic who are making ultra high-end grinders and are doing a lot of work to make sure that their grinders with big burrs align properly to get exciting and unique tasting coffee grinds. I'd love to test that one out, so if all of you guys could go and follow them on Instagram and tell them that Charlie sent you, so that hopefully they'll send me one to make a video. Okay, so to demonstrate this, I'm going to make 3 espressos with this coffee from Sweven using the multi-purpose, the Hypernova, and the conical burrs, and I reckon the difference is going to be night and day. So I've already used this coffee before and have logged in my brew ledger the ideal setting for each burr set. The first one was made using the Hypernova burrs, and that was on setting 6.4. The geometry on this one is really popular for espresso because of the way it breaks the beans that brings out that really rich body but maintains a good amount of clarity. That is a really nice espresso. It's like a bold sweetness, like orangey, citrusy sweetness. That's really good. Obviously, having excellent beans is a big part of it. This is not sponsored by Sweven, but they are a great roaster. Now with the same beans, but I'm going to quickly switch these out to the multi-purpose burrs. It's only really possible to do a test like this on the VS6. As far as I know, there are no other grinders out there that let you swap out the burrs in literally under 2 minutes without having a whole bunch of hassle from realigning and all that nonsense. That is yummy. Wow. That tastes incredibly different from the one with the Hypernova burrs. For one thing, it has a much cleaner flavor. Nice, balanced sweetness, and definitely like a more emphasized acidity. Yeah, it's got a lightness and more of a fruitiness, but the mouthfeel is just a little less. And it's definitely lacking that kind of intensity that I really like in an espresso. It honestly kind of reminds me a little bit of the difference between full fat and low fat versions. I prefer full fat everything. I generally don't go with light versions, and for espresso, this is a bit like that for me. The multi-purpose just tastes a little bit like espresso light. No shade on multi-purpose burrs, as I think pour-over drinkers tend to like them more, but I'm an espresso guy. So now on to the Conicals. So another important thing here is that I've kept the speed on 800 for a reason. Obviously, going faster with flats will grind faster and give you that higher variance like I mentioned earlier in the video. The problem with this grind speed for Conicals is that sometimes it's a little bit harder for the beans to enter the grinding chamber as it's going a little bit too fast, so they just bounce around and it actually takes a longer time for them to get ground up. So I've used 800 RPM for all of them just to keep that consistent, but that is another really interesting question about this difference in burrs, as it also affects how grind speed changes the whole process. So immediately I can tell this one is much more velvety. Even though I'm a big fan of specialty style flats, and I like the clarity and sweetness of the Hypernova burrs the most, this does just taste really good, very rich. It's definitely more mellow, a little bit less acidity compared to the other two burrs, but man, it's got this like sweetness, like syrup. Yum. So this has been a pretty complex video, and I hope I've made it concise. I know people were expecting a review of the VS6, but I thought I'd use the cool ability to switch out burrs as a jumping off point for a more nerdy and educational video. These kind of videos tend not to do as well as just a review on YouTube, but I think they're more useful and interesting. So if you want me to be able to keep doing deep dives like this, I'd really appreciate it if you can support my channel by picking up a copy of my book. Thank you so much for watching, you wonderfully overcaffeinated people, and I'll see you on the next one.